computer. And I'm going to hand over to Michael Dale, who is going to introduce our guest speaker, and then you won't hear from me until the end, when I'll take the questions and organise the questions. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much. Am I loud enough? Good.
You're perfect.
Good. I know that. Yanky was born in Letchworth. I won't tell you which year. And he won a scholarship to Carmel College in 1957, which is where I met him, around about 1958, where he spent a very happy 7 years. 2 years in Israel at Kerem Bayavne Yeshiva, then 5 years back in the UK, studying for a BA and MA at Brunel University. Yanky made Aliyah in 1972 and spent the next 26 years as a freelance copywriter, and in his spare time acting on the amateur stage and founding Israel's National English-Speaking Amateur Drama Association. He moved to Ireland in 1998 for romantic reasons, and then while he was in Ireland, he expanded his professional repertoire to writer 20 books on business, Zionist history, and chutzpah, a ghostwriter, mainly memoirs for others, a broadcaster, and corporate trainer in communication skills. He founded the Jewish Historical Society of Ireland and has spoken to audiences in 10 countries. Since the start of COVID, Yanky has delivered 150 Zoom talks to the Dublin Jewish Community's chat room, plus another 20 guest Zoom talks to audiences in Israel, the UK, and the USA. He has one son in San Diego, who is a Hebrew interpreter, and a psychotherapist son in Israel, who is also a published author and public speaker, and the son in Israel, who is also a published author and public speaker, and the father of Yanky's 3 fabulous grandchildren, he told me. Yanky is also the brother to Yanky Fachler, some of whom you might remember or know. Yanky brings oodles of imagination of his own brand of infectious enthusiasm to everything he does. Thank you for giving me that one, Yanky. Just a quick one, because I happen to have done a little bit of research. If you want to see something really worth seeing, he's done 2 talks, parts 1 and part 2, on Vimeo, called God's Little Errand Boys. Priscilla and I have watched it, and I can assure you it's really well worth watching. Yanky, over to you.
So, good evening, everybody. I think I'll stick to Jewish history, and I'll run a mile from quizzes. My answers were absolutely pathetic. So, our subject is the interlocking history of Zionism and Irish Republicanism. Based on the contemporary scene in Ireland, many observers might be excused for supposing that Irish republicanism has always opposed the Zionist enterprise. And whether we're talking about the extreme IRA and its political wing, Sinn Féin, or we're talking about Sinn Féin's view of Israel as an artificial colonialist construct, or we're talking about Sinn Féin's regular calls for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador to Ireland, or we're talking about successive Irish governments that have earned Ireland the title of the most anti-Israel country in Europe, I maybe should have called my talk The Unrelenting History of Irish Republican Antagonism to Zionism. And yet, it has not always been so. For a period in the 19th and early 20th centuries, several Irish and Jewish leaders saw parallels between and derived mutual support from their respective national struggles. When Theodor Herzog started the Zionist movement, his declared aim was to be the Parnell of the Jews, a reference to the Irish nationalist parliamentarian Charles Stewart Parnell. And there are several obvious similarities and parallels between Irish nationalism and Zionism. There's their tortuous relationship with Britain to obtain independence. There's the centrality of their diasporas and in particular the political weight of the Irish and Jewish communities in America. There's the role of their major traumas, the 19th century famine for the Irish, the 20th century Holocaust for the Jews. Many leading figures in both movements showed an active interest in the successes and failures of the other. Yet while most Zionists still retain a positive view of Irish independence, Irish Republicans' attitude to Zionism has grown progressively worse. I want to begin with two Irish train journeys. In 1921, at the height of the War of Independence in Ireland, a group of black and tans, that's the disreputable temporary constables recruited by the Royal Irish Constabulary, could not believe their luck. Bold as brass, in broad daylight, sitting on a train travelling to the Dublin suburb of Greystones, was the most wanted man in Ireland, Eamon de Valera. The black and tans pounced on him and dragged him off for interrogation. Of course, it wasn't de Valera that they had arrested. The leader of Ireland's fight for independence would hardly have taken the risk of travelling so openly. Now, the victim of mistaken identity was de Valera's doppelganger, Jacob Elian, a prominent member of Dublin's Jewish community and someone who was sympathetic to the Irish Republican cause. In September 1908, Elian co-founded the Judeo-Irish Home Rule Association. Co-founder, businessman and writer Joseph Edelstein told the audience of 60 in Dublin's Mansion House that the purpose of the association was to resolve to support such measures as will tend to secure for the people of Ireland a full grant of self-government. For the association's founders, the experience of Jews as an oppressed people seeking liberation dovetailed with the Irish struggle for self-determination. Another member of the association was Councillor Mendel Altman, whose salt merchant brother Mendel, also known as Altman the Salt Man, was a possible model for James Joyce's Leopold Bloom. At the Mansion House meeting, the name of Daniel O'Connell was evoked as a great friend of the Jewish people. O'Connell, the Irish political leader who'd successfully shed anti-Catholic discriminatory measures, enthusiastically took up the cause of Jewish emancipation. His support of the 1846 repeal of the obsolete De Judaismo law facilitated Lionel Rothschild taking his seat as the first Jewish MP. O'Connell's help may well have influenced Rothschild's magnanimous response to the Irish famine. Despite the short shelf life of the Judeo-Irish Home Rule Association, it was symptomatic of growing Jewish support for the Irish Republican cause. In Easter 1903, a vicious four-day pogrom gripped Kishinev in modern-day Moldova, leaving 49 Jews dead. And while not the worst pogrom in Jewish history, the Kishinev pogrom came just 6 years after the first Zionist Congress. And many Jews who had sat on the fence regarding Zionism were now persuaded by the pogrom to embrace the Zionist cause. Irish radical and founder of the Land League, journalist Michael Davitt, was dispatched to Russia by an American newspaper to investigate the massacre. And in his book on the Kishinev pogrom, Within the Pale, the True Story of Anti-Semitic Persecutions in Russia, Davitt declared himself to be a convinced believer in the remedy of Zionism. For Davitt, both the Irish and Jewish nations faced a shared oppression and a shared lack of political sovereignty. The second train journey was 24 years later, in 1945, when literary critic David Marcus found himself trapped in an Irish train compartment in the company of a ranting pro-IRA anti-Semitic witch. Marcus derived great pleasure in telling her that he was one of her hated Jews. He mused on the irony that his mother, Fanny Marcus, née Goldberg, together with her sister Molly, had been active members of the Irish Republican Women's paramilitary organization at the time of the 1916 Easter Rising. David's uncle, Fanny's younger brother, was Gerald Yael Goldberg, solicitor, politician, historian, and writer. And Gerald retained vivid childhood memories of the burning of Central Cork by the Black and Tans when his family had to temporarily leave home. In secondary school, Gerald got into trouble for demanding to be excused from Armistice Day on the grounds that Britain was responsible for the deaths of two Cork Lord Mayors, Thomas McCurtain and Terence McSweeney. And when Gerald himself became the first Jew to be elected Lord Mayor of Cork in 1977, he commissioned portraits of these two Republican martyrs. Yet just 5 years later, the Cork synagogue was firebombed when Israel invaded South Lebanon in 1982 to evict Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization. And after receiving death threats, Gerald, a lifelong Zionist, was so unnerved that a devoted public servant could be targeted in his own city that he seriously contemplated making Aliyah to Israel. As we saw, Irish Jews had no problem reconciling their Jewish nationalism, the Zionist cause, with their support for Irish nationalism, the cause of Irish independence. And the 1916 Easter Rising fell on Pesach. So the Jewish festival that celebrates the Exodus from Egypt 3,500 years ago. And as the predominantly Zionist Jewish community in Ireland recited L'Shana Ba'a B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem at the Seder table, they would have seen a strong parallel between the Jewish fight for freedom from the Egyptians and the Irish fight for political freedom from the British. A notable Jewish sympathizer with the Republican cause was Rabbi Isaac Herzog. Soon after he accepted the post of Dublin Communal Rabbi in 1919, the Provisional Irish government appointed him as chief rabbi, even before formal independence from Britain. IRA leaders on the run hid in the Herzog family home in Dublin, earning Rabbi Herzog the title the Sinn Féin Rabbi. Rabbi Herzog's son Chaim, a future president of the State of Israel, wrote, "My father was an open partisan of the Irish cause, and in many circles in Ireland, our family name is still associated with those who fought for liberty." Rabbi Herzog established a close working and personal relationship with Eamon de Valera, who sent him an early draft of the new Irish Constitution with its explicit guarantee of religious freedom and equal rights for Jews. If Rabbi Herzog was the Sinn Féin rabbi, the man known as the father of Sinn Féin, Arthur Griffith, came with serious anti-Semitic baggage. At the time of the Dreyfus affair, he wrote, "I have in former years often declared that the three evil influences of the century were the pirate, the Freemason, and the Jew." Griffith described the 1904 Limerick boycott as simply a boycott against the usurers, even though he knew full well that most of the Jewish victims of the boycott were tradesmen, not moneylenders. Yet the same Griffith also tipped his hat to those honest and patriotic Jews who desire the re-establishment of the Hebrew nation in Palestine. And Griffith seemed to have diluted his strident anti-Semitic rhetoric after 1910, when he met and befriended Michael Noyk, later the honorary solicitor of the Dublin Hebrew congregation. Noyk remained Griffith's personal solicitor until Griffith died in 1922. And Noyk defended Irish Republican men and women in court and provided access to several safe houses. He was at the quayside when de Valera and other nationalists returned home from British jails, and he worked for de Valera's election campaign in 1917. In the 1918 general election, Noyk was the election agent for Constance Markovich. Noyk defended Sean McCowan in an open and shut murder trial, which ended with McCowan being sentenced to death. Once the escape plans concocted by Irish revolutionary leader Michael Collins was to get Noyk to smuggle a revolver into McCowan's cell. In an exquisite irony, McCowan would later become Irish Minister of Justice. Noyk became a high-level official with the first Dáil Department of Finance, headed by Collins, and when Noyk died in 1966, his funeral in Dublin's Jewish cemetery was attended by then Irish Prime Minister Taoiseach Sean Lemass, and he received full graveside military honours from the men of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA. Griffith's ambivalence to Jews was shared by the Dáil Minister for Foreign Affairs, Count George Noble Plunkett. Influenced by religious anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories, Plunkett wrote to de Valera in 1921, warning that Republicans should be wary of too close a relationship with the debased Jews, because their codes of honor and morals, were not Christian. As they would say today, duh. The antagonism of the British press to Ireland, wrote Plunkett, was because the press was largely owned and controlled by Jews. Yet Plunkett also claimed to have Jewish friends. Their best men show great distinction in music, are fine linguists, cosmopolitan, sensitive, enthusiastic about art, genial, charitable, and clean living. Sinn Féin parliamentarian George Gavin Duffy complained to the Dáil in 1921 that the main difficulty in getting facts known abroad was that big Jew firms in London had complete control of the first news wires in respect to Irish affairs. Anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic rhetoric also found expression in the Irish American press. In March 1919, the Gaelic American complained, "Now that the ancient home of the Jews occupied by them after their flight out of Egypt and their wandering in the desert has been regained for them, they steadfastly refuse to avail themselves of it and are demanding community autonomy and special privileges in every country in which they are found instead." But the picture was by no means uniform. At the 1919 Irish Race Convention in Philadelphia, Rabbi Joseph Krauskopf extolled the parallel between the Irish and Zionist struggles for independence. Never in the history of both the Irish and the Jew was there a time when they have been nearer the realization of their dreams than now. Ireland will be free and will be ruled by the Irish, even as Palestine will be free and ruled by the Jewish people. In post-independence Ireland in 1922, the Jewish Chronicle described the Jews of Ireland as being in hearty sympathy with young Ireland in its struggle for political and national emancipation. Their hearts were ever with those who aspire to revive and resurrect Irish nationhood. The Irish World, published in New York, optimistically asserted that nearly all of the 10,000 Jews in Ireland, in fact there were only 5,000, were Irish Republicans. American Zionists, said the paper, found in Irish history and Irish nationalist aspirations a tale of statelessness, exile, and liberation that resonated deeply with their own conception of the past and hopes for the future. British authorities viewed any cooperation between Irish Republicans and Jews with suspicion. One British official described the mean, dishonest, insufferably conceited Irishman as an inferior race, only sufferable when they are whipped, like the Jews. Some British conservative diehards believed that the Irish could not have conceived of the idea of rebellion themselves. It had to be the Jews who were behind it. British intelligence chief Basil Thomson claimed that trouble in Ireland was the result of a Yiddo-Sinn Féin alliance, and that the IRA was merely the Irish section of Lenin's Jew government. The Irish Jew who sat most prominently, if sometimes uncomfortably, at the intersection of Irish and Jewish nationalism is Robert Briscoe, son of a Lithuanian immigrant and later the Lord Mayor of Dublin. And with the possible exception of Joyce's fictional hero Leopold Bloom, Briscoe is probably Ireland's most famous Jew. After the 1916 Easter Rising, Briscoe's gun-running activities on behalf of Irish nationalists brought him to the attention of Michael Collins, who affectionately referred to him as my blessed Jew man. Briscoe switched his allegiance to de Valera, whose rejection of the partition treaty with Britain caused the Irish Civil War. And Briscoe entered the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, as a member of de Valera's Fianna Fáil party in 1927 and remained until 1965. Barney Mellows recalled that when Briscoe joined the party, he was the first Jew we had. Briscoe spoke for the Republican cause at public meetings, insisting that his being a Hebrew did not lessen his Irishness. The rising tide of Nazism and the sympathetic attitude of the Catholic Church towards the anti-communism of international fascism made Briscoe increasingly aware of his Jewishness. He was also drawn to the magnetic charisma of Zionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky, who founded the revisionist Zionist organization. Kevin McCarthy neatly sums up Briscoe's career in the subtitle of his biography of Briscoe, Sinn Féin revolutionary, Fianna Fáil nationalist, and revisionist Zionist. Briscoe facilitated Jabotinsky's visit to Dublin in early 1938. And in Briscoe's 1958 autobiography, he provides an account of Jabotinsky's meeting with de Valera. De Valera expressed skepticism of the justness of the Zionist project. Mr. de Valera, said Jabotinsky, I've been reading Irish history. As a result of the Great Famine of 1847 and 1848, I believe the population fell from 8 million to 4 million. Now, supposing it had been reduced to 50,000 and that the country had been resettled by the Welsh, the Scots, and the English, would you then have given up the claim of Ireland for the Irish? When de Valera replied that the Irish would never relinquish Ireland, Jabotinsky said, neither can the Jews ever give up their claim to Palestine. The Jabotinsky-inspired Zionist underground militias confronting British forces in Palestine clearly drew inspiration from the Irish Republican struggle. Avraham Stern, leader of the Stern Gang, translated O'Hagerty's The Victory of Sinn Féin into Hebrew. When Etzel member Avshalom Chaviv was on trial, he accused the British of drowning the Irish uprising in rivers of blood, yet Ireland rose free in spite of you. Abba Achi Meir published an article in the daily Doa Hayom entitled Sinn Féin. And the head of operations for Lehi, future Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, studied Irish republicanism and adopted the name of Michael as his nom de guerre in homage to Irish revolutionary excuse me, Michael Collins. Although Briscoe remained a faithful Fianna Fáiler all his life, his friendship with de Valera did not help him secure Irish visas for German Jews seeking refuge in Ireland before World War II. And it only emerged from newly released state papers that government ministers and Department of Justice officials repeatedly lied to Briscoe about their supposed efforts to grant visas. Briscoe's son Joe often told me that he was glad his father died before he learned of the extent of the betrayal by party colleagues. Briscoe's friendship with de Valera also failed to prevent de Valera's notorious condolence visit to visit the German legation in Dublin after Hitler's suicide in 1945. In 2003, Irish Justice Minister Michael Mcdowell publicly apologized for Ireland's sins of omission and sins of commission during World War II. Wartime policy, he said, was inspired by a culture of muted anti-Semitism in Ireland. At an official level, he continued, the Irish state was at best coldly polite, and behind closed doors, the Irish state was antipathetic, hostile, and unfeeling toward the Jews. No one exemplifies the schizophrenic attitude of the Irish government to the Nazis more than Charles Bewley, a blatant Nazi sympathizer and a rabid anti-Semite. Bewley was originally sent to Germany in 1921 as Irish trade representative. A barroom brawl in Berlin with Briscoe, during which Bewley harangued Briscoe about his Jewish faith, did not prevent Bewley being posted to Berlin again in 1933, 7 months after the Nazis took office, this time as Ireland's top diplomat. And over the next 6 years, he thwarted the attempts of Jewish refugees from Germany to gain visas to Ireland. On November the 9th, 2013, I accompanied my then 90-year-old father to Berlin, where he was the guest speaker at the rededication of his synagogue on Brunnenstrasse that he watched being smashed up on Kristallnacht 75 years earlier. And I used the opportunity of being in Berlin to attend an exhibition at the Centrum Judaicum. The museum had written to all the countries that had diplomats stationed in Berlin at the time of Kristallnacht, asking them for copies of the reports that the diplomats sent back in the wake of the murderous pogrom. All the diplomats, even those from Italy and Japan, future Axis allies of Nazi Germany, expressed their dismay at what they witnessed. There was one lamentable exception, Charles Bewley. The curators of the exhibition were shocked that any diplomat could have sent back such a, I quote, disgraceful and unfathomable 13-page report. The anti-Semitic virulence in Bewley's report is unique among the diplomatic dispatches, the director of the museum, Dr. Hermann Simon, told me. Of all the diplomatic reports, Bewley's is unusually demagogic and nasty. When the Irish government finally twigged that Bewley had gone native in Nazi Germany, he was recalled to Dublin in August 1939 as war loomed. He refused to return and spent the rest of his life in Berlin as a Nazi propagandist. Links between the IRA and the Nazis were formalized in 1937 when IRA Chief of Staff Tom Barry traveled to Germany. Senior IRA figures Sean Russell and Frank Ryan came to Berlin for talks with top members of the Nazi regime, including future SS war criminals, in an effort to secure support for the IRA's plan to overthrow the Free State and reunite Ireland North and South. In August 1940, Russell and Ryan boarded a German U-boat bound for Ireland, but the mission was called off when Russell died aboard the vessel. And despite controversy, a statue of Russell has been prominently displayed in a Dublin park since 1951. During World War II, the IRA's main publication, War News, became increasingly pro-Nazi in tone, expressing satisfaction that the cleansing fire of the German armies was driving the Jews from Europe. In 1943, by which time about 4 million Jews had already been liquidated, a newly elected Oliver Flanagan from the so-called moderate Fine Gael party stood up in the door and announced, "There is one thing that Germany did, and that was to rout the Jews out of their country. And until we rout the Jews out of this country, it doesn't matter a hair's breadth what orders you make. Where the bees are, there is honey, and where the Jews are, there is money." No one stood up to object. Once the Zionist struggle culminated in Israel's independence in 1948, some 26 years after Irish independence, there was a glimmer of hope that the Irish government would acknowledge the parallels between Irish republicanism and Zionism. In early 1949, Ireland's Minister of External Affairs, Sean McBride, announced, "Our common suffering from persecution and certain similarities in the histories of the two races create a special bond of sympathy and understanding between the Irish and Jewish peoples." Shortly afterwards, at the installation ceremony in Dublin for the new chief rabbi, Emanuel Jacobowitz, Irish Prime Minister Taoiseach John Costello announced that in the chief rabbi's honor, the Irish government was extending de facto recognition to the new state of Israel. Even some voices in Sinn Féin praised this statement. An article in a Sinn Féin journal said that the Jews have given us the finest nationalist literature in the world. They have also set the finest nationalist example. Israel represents the triumph of Sinn Féin. But Costello's announcement proved to be nothing more than lip service. It took another almost 30 years before full diplomatic relations were established between Ireland and Israel. And it was only in 1996, a full century since Herzog had declared his ambition to be the Parnell of the Jews, that an Israeli embassy finally opened in Dublin. There is still no unanimity among historians about the extent of Zionist and Irish Jewish support for Irish republicanism. Historian Dermot Keogh suggests that individual Jews may have opted for the cause of radical Irish nationalism to a greater extent than is realized. The recent centenary commemorations in Ireland, which totally ignored any Jewish role in the struggle for Irish independence, would seem to vindicate Keogh. In contrast, historian Natalie Wynne criticizes what she calls a feel-good factor in popular historiography, which overstates Jewish involvement in Irish republicanism while underplaying Irish anti-Semitism. In contemporary Ireland, it is a rare politician or journalist who is prepared to challenge the cozy anti-Zionist and anti-Israel consensus. Irish government ministers are usually the first among their EU colleagues to condemn Israeli policies, and much of the Irish print and electronic media is highly critical of Israel. And these are the so-called moderates. In the meantime, the standard bearer of Irish republicanism, the IRA's successor Sinn Féin, has continued to display a visceral hatred of the Zionist enterprise and the Jewish state. And far from acknowledging any shared history between Irish republicanism and Zionism, long-term Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams accused Israel of repressive actions akin to the worst years of British oppression in Ireland. Under Adams' leadership, Sinn Féin's anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian policy allowed parliamentarian Angus O'Snoddy to openly compare the Israeli ambassador to Goebbels. On another occasion, O'Snoddy said, "Israel is without doubt one of the most abhorrent and despicable regimes on the planet." My wife comes from a small Irish town called Carrickmacross. In 2010, Israel's then ambassador to Ireland, Zion Evroni, paid a goodwill visit to the town and signed the visitor's book. In a striking example of the pettiness, bloody-mindedness, and intense anti-Zionism of Sinn Féin under Gerry Adams, a Sinn Féin councillor persuaded his fellow councillors to vote to rip out the page in the visitor's book that contained Evroni's message. Under its new leader, Mary Lou McDonald, Sinn Féin is likely to become part of an Irish government in the not-too-distant future. And if that happens, we may well yet reach new lows in the decoupling of the interlocking history of the Zionist and Irish Republican movements. Not that we have to wait for Sinn Féin. At a time when even the Irish media is praising Israel's vaccination rollout, some Irish politicians are deflecting attention away from Ireland's own deplorable rollout by finding an excuse to attack Israel. Independent Senator Francis Black, the malevolent author of the pro-BDS bill making its way through the Irish Parliament, commented last week, "The Irish government should not exalt Israel for their vaccine regime, but condemn their discriminatory practice against the Palestinians." We began with 2 train journeys. We'll close with 1 bus journey, 1 schoolyard conversation, and an encounter in Dublin's National Gallery. 3 anti-Semitic incidents that I heard firsthand from the people involved. In the middle of World War II, a Jewish schoolgirl was on the bus home from her Dublin school when another passenger, a well-dressed woman, calmly addressed her in a frightening, sneering tone, "Just you wait till Hitler comes." 70 years later, just 8 years ago, an American-born Jewish schoolgirl was very confused when another girl said to her out of the blue in their Limerick schoolyard, "You killed Jesus." And just 5 years ago, a young diplomat working in the Israeli embassy in Ireland was showing a mother who was visiting from Israel around Dublin's National Gallery. They wanted to record their visit for posterity, so they asked the well-heeled, middle-aged Irish woman if she wouldn't mind taking their photo on their phone. The woman had heard them talking a language she couldn't identify, so she asked, "Where are you from?" "Israel," they replied. And with not a shred of embarrassment, she told them, "It's a pity the ovens didn't get you." It is no exaggeration to say that the early promise that the parallel paths of Irish republicanism and Zionism would lead to continued mutual respect has gone. And I imagine that the likes of Michael Davitt, who declared himself a convinced Zionist, and Jacob Elian, who founded the Judeo-Irish Home Rule Association, must be turning in their graves. Thank you.
Yanky, that was terrific. Thank you very much. You can see people clapping, but we can't hear them. If there's any, are you happy to take some questions?
Of course, what a question.
Lovely. Well, that's the first question. You answered that one, okay. If anybody's got any questions, if they could raise their hand and I will come to them. There's been no questions on the chat. Roy, if you can unmute yourself, please.
I have. Yanky, that was enthralling. Do you feel comfortable being a Jew in Ireland with the anti-Semitism that you've been relating to us?
Okay, I can't yet describe this as anti-Semitism because the Jewish community in general has not been directly targeted. Yeah, you know, the odd daubing on a synagogue and that sort of thing. But I do know that some of the elderly Jews who were born in Ireland have felt less and less comfortable over the last decade because of the growing strident anti-Israelism, which, as we all know, very fine line, if there is a line, between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So, yeah, people who know me know who I am, what I stand for, and if I ever go public with my pro-Israel declarations, I get the usual hate mail and that sort of thing. Am I worried? Not yet. No. Could it get worse? Like I say, if a Sinn Féin party gets into government, which is very plausible now, it wasn't before, but it is now, I think that the anti-Israel rhetoric will be ramped up, and then it'll be even more uncomfortable for the Jews of Ireland.
Thank you. Thanks, Roy. Any other questions? I can't see any other hands. Irene, unmute yourself.
What do you think actually caused so much anti-Semitism when there had been an alliance before?
Okay, the alliance was a long time ago. There was mutual respect among the founders of Irish nationalism and Zionism before there was even an Irish state. It wasn't across the board, but like I say, someone like David is a major figure in Irish political history. He declares in writing in his book, I am a confirmed Zionist. So he didn't have any issues. And even some of the people who were borderline or worse anti-Semites had a respect for the Zionist cause. Now, maybe all they wanted was to get rid of the Jews, so they'd all go to Palestine. Now, you know, that's also possible. But certainly many of the Jewish community, we're now talking about second and possibly even third generation Irish Jews, we're talking about in the 1920 or so, many of them felt it just natural to be pro Irish independence, although there were also many Jews who, of course, were pro-British. What went wrong? I think that it's the old story, the oldest story in the world, in a Catholic country like Ireland, anti-Semitism was being spewed by the churches. And it just was. And whether people had left the church or were still in the church, it was just in the DNA. Almost as bad as Poland, I would say, which is the worst example of where anti-Semitism, as Yitzhak Shamir said, is in the mother's milk. So there's latent anti-Semitism. The Six-Day War was at first cheered by people in Ireland who thought, wow, you know, good old Israel. But very quickly, we're talking about the 70s, Gaddafi gets into the act. Gaddafi sells arms to the IRA, and even though not everybody in Ireland is a member of the IRA or even supported them, there was a grudging feeling that they were fighting their fight. And so if they were pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, that didn't help our cause. I put it that way.
Can't see any more hands. Any other? Irene, back to Irene.
Just to carry that on, has there been a huge influx of radical Islamists recently?
Oh, radical what?
Muslims.
Now, that's a very, very interesting question. When I came to Ireland 22 years ago, the number of Muslims in Ireland was probably round about the same as the Jewish community, very small, couple of thousand. Now it's probably 80,000, 90,000. But, it's a very big but, they do not make radicalized noises. They do not lead the rent-a-crowd processions that used to stand outside the Israeli embassy or walk through the center of town against Israel. They've kept a low profile. So they did not get involved. They have not got involved, with a few exceptions, in anti-Israel activities. There is a very prominent Palestinian embassy. The Palestinians had an embassy in Dublin before the Israelis. I think that tells you something. But no, I think that we don't have the same problems, certainly not the same problems as in Britain or as in France or Belgium or Holland. So in that respect, I think we should be quite happy. And the relationships between our head rabbi, we don't have a chief rabbi, is quite, and the head of our community, you know, quite cordial with the heads of the Christian and Muslim communities.
I think Jeff Wilson's got something to.
It's on the same lines as the question just asked. I'll read it out. We had a great break in Dublin a couple of years ago and found it surprisingly cosmopolitan. Does this mean that Jews don't really get noticed?
You're right, they don't. They got more noticed 50, 60 years ago when there were more Jews. And today you will still meet, and I meet people who never met a Jew. Not that unusual, especially if you're talking about people outside of Dublin. Never met a Jew. And so, and which is from our point of view, not a bad thing. No, they're not prominent. There was a time when there were 3 sitting members of parliament who were Jewish, and now there are none. So again, even at that level, the prominence has depleted. There used to be Jewish judges, very prominent, very well known. Now there are none. There was a generation that produced very high, not just high quality, but high status doctors, judges, and parliamentarians. And that generation has gone and has not been replaced. So in terms of public consciousness, I would say that you're right. They're not much on the radar.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank
If I might just add, Yanky, to the list of politicians and academics and doctors, I'd like to add to that generation a wonderful Rabbi, Eddie Jackson, who came from Ireland and came to Kenton and married us. So we're grateful. We're grateful to Ireland for that as well. Any more questions? Any hands? I can't see any hands. If there's no further questions, can I pass to our Honorary President, Irene Lehman, to give a formal roundup? Thank you.
Yanky, I'd like to say thank you so much on behalf of all of us, because I personally found that quite riveting, but I think mainly that's because I have to admit to being largely ignorant of a lot of the history, but I found it quite fascinating at the time of Israeli independence, and all the similarities you wrote. I wrote myself a little table as you were going through the similarities. I thought it was quite very, very interesting. So I think you held us all captive, and I'd like to say thank you very much for coming to Kenton.
Thank you for having me, and anytime.
I'd like to invite everybody to unmute themselves. I'll leave it running for another 15 minutes because I know people like to chat. We'll see how we go. I will stop the recording though.
Thank you very much.